So thanks, Harriet, for the introduction. And I also would like to thank the staff from the hospital, particularly the physio and the speech therapist, who I think I've converted into becoming Jane Austen fanatics. And lastly, may I thank Miss Jane Austen, who provided my motivation to talk to you today. So let us begin, because there was a great deal of needlework to be done. Now, words change their meaning over time. A simple word such as work means different things to different people, even at the same time and in the same place. But it greatly changes to meaning over time. When I think of work, I think of some task such as preparing and presenting a talk today. If it were to ask my great niece, she'd be talking in terms of her career. My mother considered her work in terms of having a clean, tidy house and providing nourishing meals for the family. But 220 years ago, Jane Austen would not consider her work as sitting at a desk and writing so many words before lunch. She would have spoken her work as the needlework on which she was engaged at that moment, because there was always sewing to be done. Mr. Singer did not invent the domestic sewing machine until 1851. Jane Austen died in 1817. That meant that she lived in an age when everything, from underwear to bed sheets to curtains to handkerchiefs, was hand-sewn at home by the ladies of the house. And when they had finished sewing their shirts and neckcloths and mended all the household linen, they turned to the poor basket and made clothes for the poor of the parish. They would also think about embroidering pretty little needle cases as gifts for friends, or crocheting a new reticule or collar for personal adornment. Jane Austen did not consider that the 6 major novels that she wrote as being her work. She would have thought of the patchwork quilt that she and her mother and her sister made. That was work. She would have thought of the needle case she embroidered for her niece as work. There are references to needlework included as part of everyday life throughout Austen's novels, but particularly in Mansfield Park, where needlework is mentioned on 40 occasions. And the quote that I have taken as the title of this paper, "There was a great deal of needlework to be done," with suggestions from Marlene Ardita to do so, refers to the amount of sewing required when the young people of Mansfield Park decided that they would put on a play. Today I want to look at the way in which Austen used needlework as a literary device to explore character and status within this novel. I want to give you some idea of the volume and the variety of needlework involved when some young members of the idle rich decided to enjoy themselves with amateur theatricals in pre-sewing machine days. And I want you to give some idea of the status of those who sewed and the value that placed on their efforts. So let's start by looking at Fanny Price, poor relation, bullied by Mrs. Norris, depended upon by Lady Bertram to get over any difficulty in her needlework, and ignored by most of the other characters until they needed her to run an errand. One of the ways in which Austen shows us how Fanny fits into the social structure of Mansfield Park can be found in the following quote. It's when Fanny had just been told that they needed her to be in the play, and this upset her so much that she went off to the East Room to gain composure. It would be so horrible for her to act that she was inclined to suspect the truth and purity of her own scruples. And as she looked around her, the claims of her cousins to being obliged were strengthened by the sight of present upon present that she had received from them. The table between the windows was covered with work boxes and netting boxes, which had been given her at times principally by Tom, and she grew bewildered as the amount of the debt which all of these kind remembrance produced. Now, nobody except Mrs. Norris was deliberately unkind to Fanny, but nobody really thought about her. And this reference to the gift that she received shows how little her wants and needs were consulted. Work boxes and netting boxes may be very useful things to have, but unless you are a collector, you only need one. Not a table covered with them. You can just imagine Tom on Christmas Eve, on the morning of Fanny's birthday, or just about his return from a journey to some watering place, thinking, "Oh, I forgot about a gift for Fanny," and sending a servant off with a wad of money to get her workbooks or something, quite forgetting that the last 6 presents she had given her were also workboxes. And he did not wish Fanny harm, he just didn't think about her. So instead of consulting her interests, he would spend money on a gift she did not need. It would have been so easy to select a present for Fanny which would really enjoy. She was a great reader, especially of travel journeys and biography. She and her brother William, who was in the Navy, were regular correspondents, and paper was a very expensive commodity. She had a very simple wardrobe, no jewellery. So a book, some stationery, a pretty scarf or a shawl or a bracelet would all have been suitable and appreciated gifts if only a little thought had gone into selection. In that quote, you may also see that the inappropriate gifts placed on onus of obligation on Fanny. The word claims, be obliged, amount of debt. She would be expected to be grateful for a thoughtless, useless gift given because the donor forgot that they had given her the same present last year and the year before and the year before that, thinking of her only as the quiet little mouse sitting by Lady Bertram with her sewing, not as a human being with a personality or interests, wants and needs of her own. We learn much about the character of Lady Bertram through reference to her needlework. She was a lazy, rather stupid woman whose only claim to fame had been her pretty face, which managed to procure her a husband as prosperous as Sir Thomas. Lady Bertram spent her life dozing on a sofa, occasionally setting a stitch in, and this is one of my favourite quotes, a piece of needlework of little use and no beauty. Whenever she came to a difficult place in that needlework, she handed it to Fanny, who would work the difficult part for her. She took absolutely no interest in the welfare of her children. During Sir Thomas's absence at Antigua, she had no idea that Maria was becoming emotionally involved with Henry Crawford while engaged to James Rushworth. She could not see that Julia was unhappy and felt slighted, or that Tom was behaving recklessly. But when Sir Thomas arrived home, we are told that during his absence she considered that Her own time had been irreproachably spent. She had done a great deal of carpet work and had made many yards of fringe. And to neglect one's duty as a mother while dozing over unwanted, ugly, useless needlework was Lady Bertram's idea of spending her time irreproachably. Then when Sir Thomas planned a ball to introduce Fanny to local society, Lady Bertram delegated all responsibility as hostess to her housekeeper and, of course, to Mrs. Norris. The only interest Lady Bertram displayed in preparations for the ball was that her maid was rather hurried in making a new dress. And as an afterthought, she sent her dresser Chapman to help Fanny dress for the ball, even though Chapman arrived too late to be of service to Fanny. In all those hours when Fanny sat by her side, helping her with the current piece of useless needlework, it never occurred to Lady Bertram to ask Fanny what she would be wearing to the ball, or consider the possibility of sewing some pretty trifle for Fanny to use or wear. Mrs. Norris shows us her pettiness and self-importance through references to needlework. Throughout the novel, she exhorts Fanny to be busy with her needle. She speaks of how she almost broke her back in cutting out the calico for the poor basket. She tells everyone how much of her time has been spent on supervising the cutting of the fabric for the play economically. And she did not have to spend for more pink satin because of her clever supervision of the cutting of the pink satin cloak. But not once in the novel do we ever see her using needle and thread. Mrs. Norris's inefficient bustle is shown through her approach to needlework just as much as it is through her interference with the butler's noble fire that she reduces to a pitiful splutter. Needlework is used by Austen to establish harmonious backdrop for Edmund Bertram's courtship of Mary Crawford. Mrs. Grant and her tambour frame were not without their use, as Mrs. Crawford played her harp before an open window on a pleasant summer's day. This picture of romantic bliss would not be complete without the unobtrusive chaperonage of Mrs. Grant plying her needle. Mary Crawford plays her harp, learns to ride a horse, sings glees, but we never see her engaged in useful activities such as addressing the poor basket or even embroidering a pretty trifle. Her role in the novel is to be a decorative distraction. Julia and Maria Bertram's activity with needlework tools says little for their industry, talent or interest in contributing to the welfare and comfort of the household or the parish. On the day they were supposed to be entertaining their newly arrived cousin Fanny, they adjourned to whatever might be the favourite holiday sport of the moment, making artificial flowers or wasting gold paper. The east room contained a faded footstool of Julia's work, too ill done for the drawing room, and 3 transparencies made in a range for transparencies. Now, these passing references to the Bertram girls' needlework and craft activities confirm their character as being frivolous, self-interested, and useless. The normal running of the household, such as Mansfield Park, required a great deal of sewing to be done. The work of keeping the household linen in good condition, of providing enough well-hemmed neckcloths, nightshirts, shirts, underclothes, handkerchiefs, dresses, was constant and labour-intensive. All of this work would be performed by female members of the household. But we know that Lady Bertram did none of the practical sewing, that Mrs. Norris told others what to do, but did little herself, and that the two daughters of the household had no interest in or skill for practical sewing. The only members of the household who did the great amount of sewing required to keep Mansfield Park in order and its inhabitants clothed were Fanny and the housemaids. When the young people decided to produce a play, they were straining the resources of the domestic staff and of Fanny Price, who already had enough sewing to fill their day. Nowhere in the novel do we hear Tom or Mr. Yates or Julia or Maria express concern for the extra work that will be demanded of the female domestic staff or of Fanny. It's thoughtlessness and ignorance, rather than deliberate selfishness, that accounts for their lack of concern. But indeed there was a great deal of needlework to be done. So let's look at the way in which the young people approached their production of Lovers' Vows. They had no experience in the field. Indeed, some of them had never even seen a play performed, either by amateurs or professionals. But when has ignorance ever stopped anyone from attempting something that they never think will give them pleasure? As is often the way with inexperienced actors, they concentrated on the peripheral things rather than the important ones. They decided that they had to have a proper theatre. So they proceeded to convert the billiard room into a theatre. That's the sort of place that Regency billiards were. If you think about it, all they've got to do is move the furniture a little bit and you've got tons of acting space. But the estate carpenter had to drop his normal work to build a stage with a proscenium arch, which could not help but damage the plasterwork. And plasterwork was a beautiful and expensive feature in houses of the period. They knew that you could not have a play without having a stage curtain to pull up and down between scenes, so a large roll of green baize was delivered from Northampton and cut out, saving 3/4 of a yard, I might say. All of this happened before a play had even been chosen. They decided that they needed painted backdrops from every scene, and they employed a scene painter from London to do this. The play that they eventually decided to put on is one that was very popular at the time. The Lovers' Vows really was a really truly popular play. It's an adaptation of German play and one that was considered rather risque at the time. Many of you who have read the novel of Mansfield Park have not had the opportunity to read the play Lovers' Vows. It's really not a top seller these days. So here's a brief outline. The story involves a woman called Agatha who many years ago had been seduced and abandoned by Baron Weidenheim. As a result of this seduction, she had a son called Frederick, who grew up to become a soldier. The Baron moved to France, where he married and had one daughter, Amelia. And after the death of his wife, he returned to the own castle in Germany with his daughter and her tutor, a clergyman called Anhalt. The Baron is attempting to arrange a match for his daughter with a rich but stupid man called Count Castle. But Amelia is in love with the tutor Anhalt. The wronged woman Agatha has fallen on hard times and is starving when her son returns from the war and she faints into his arms. After appropriate amounts of drama, Amelia marries Anhalt, Count Cassel is sent packing, and Baron Waldenham is reunited with Agatha, who is really his real true love. Their son Frederick is given appropriate recognition, and they all lived happily ever after. So that's true. Now, it's a 5-act play with 9 scenes altogether. Scene 1 is a road with the inn on one side and a cottage on the other. There are 2 scenes inside the cottage, 4 scenes inside the castle, 1 in an open field and 1 scene inside a prison cell. That means that the scene painter from London would have to produce 5 backgrounds and 5 sets of wing flats. Now, the play has the following roles: Agatha, Frederick, Berard, Amelia, and Anhalt and Countessa, but you've also got landlord, butler, cottager, and cottager's wife. There are 3 other small roles, but Tom manages either to roll them into extra lines for cottager or the landlady, or omit them altogether. The butler is a comic role, much of which is in rhyming couplets. Now, the young people do not have auditions. They just sit about a table and work out who'll play what. The big problem comes when looking at the female roles. There are 2 good female roles, Amelia and Agatha. There are 3 girls, Maria, Julia and Mary. After some discussion in which Henry plays a prominent part, Julia finds herself relegated to playing cottager's wife. She considers herself spurned by Henry, refuses the role, and spends her sulking in a corner. So the roles are filled thus. Agatha, the wrong woman, is played by Maria Bertram. Frederick, her son, that's in whose arms she has to swoon, is played by Henry Crawford. Baron Waldenheim is played by Honourable John Yates. Amelia, Mary Crawford. Mrs. Grant was talked into playing the small role of cottager's wife. That was the one that they wanted Fanny to do at first. With the roles decided, they get down to business. But they have no idea what the business of producing a play is. And they have no idea and care less about the expense or work involved. After all, they have servants who can do all the hard work and a father who will pay the bills. Their preparations and planning, or lack of thereof, would make anyone who has ever been involved in theatre in the smallest way shudder. They do not even have a rehearsal schedule, but go off into corners to rehearse the bits that they want to with the people they want to be with. Maria and Henry keep rehearsing their scene where she faints in his arms because it gives them a chance to have a cuddle. Yates proclaims his lines loudly all over the house because he loves the sound of his own voice. Mary and Edmund are too shy to each other to rehearse their big scene together. And nobody wants to rehearse with Mr. Rushworth. Here is how Austen describes their progress. Fanny, being always a very courteous listener, and often the only listener at hand, came in for the complaints and distresses of most of them. She knew that Mr. Yates was in general thought to rant dreadfully, that Mr. Yates was disappointed in Henry Crawford, that Tom Bertram spoke so quick it would be unintelligible, and that Mrs. Grant spoiled everything by laughing, that Edmund was behindhand with his part, and that it was a misery to have anything to do with Mr. Rushworth, who was wanting a prompter through every speech. It's interesting to note that painting 5 backdrops was considered to be work for a professional scene painter who had to come from London and be employed at great expense. But the making of a stage curtain could be relegated to the women of the household as part of their normal duties. We may well ask, did you ever need a stage curtain? I know of at least one recently built theatre that did not even possess a stage curtain. Of course, today a stage curtain is very expensive to maintain because of fire regulations, and stage lighting is far more sophisticated than the oil lamps or candles that were available 200 years ago. On the other hand, the Austen family used to put on plays at Christmas time, and they used to put them on either in the rectory dining room or in the barn. I doubt if either the Austen family dining room or their barn ran to a stage curtain of any kind. We should also remember that the Mansfield Park theatricals were only going to amount to one performance of one play with a small invited audience, mainly consisting of Lady Bertram and Pug. They could have survived without a stage curtain. However, stage curtain they must have. Let's look more closely at the work involved in making this stage curtain from the enormous roll of green baize that was delivered from the Northampton. First, we should look at the size of this curtain. The rooms in Mansfield Park were large rooms, and a billiard room has to be large to fit a billiard in, so let's say it's about 18 feet wide. Just say it had 3 feet of wings there, 12 feet of acting space, then there, and another 3 there. So that's about 12 feet, the width of the curtain. There's also a look at the height. Of course, that's extended because it's a Regency theatre, not just the billiard room change. But say it was about 18 feet, so you had 3 at the bottom and 3 from the top. So you're looking there, a curtain about 12 feet high and 12 feet across. It's a fair bit that girls have got a hand sewn. What kind of a curtain was it? Now, we can thank Mrs. Norris for some information on that. She says, "Of there's very little sense in a play without a curtain, and I am much mistaken if you do not find it draw up into very handsome festoons." So this suggests that when the curtain was pulled, it wasn't going from side to side, but from up, like that. Now you're going to sew my handwork from that, which I hand sewn. Didn't use my singer. It's more like a Roman blind. Now, if you think it'll be a flat one, look on that side, you have rings coming up, cord coming, and then you pull the cord. Hey! And you've got handsome festoons. That's what they was going to sew. Actually, the type of curtain doesn't need as fullness of one that draws to the side. If they're taking to the side, it'd be 3 widths, but you only need twice as much to get to the Roman. So what you need, 24 feet wide, because it's twice as wide, and come up 8 yards wide, 5. That's what the house girls have to sew. Now, of course, you can't get a piece of fabric that wide, not even today. But at that time, the looms was so that you could only get a width of fabric 27 inches wide. That was, so you get a curtain. I worked out that they would have to have had 12 widths from end to the side. From the bottom, from 5 yards, yeah. It's a hell of a lot of sewing to be done. That means also a total of at least 60 yards of fabric. This is my drawing art. You can see the 12 widths of fabric. Each one is hand sewing from one end to the top. Then, of course, you've got a hem. That's 24 from the top down the back there. When you've finished, curtain rings have got to be sewn on. All those little crosses are the curtain rings. All have been hand sewn. I've worked out that the sewers would have to sew by hand 11 15-foot seams, 2 side edges, each of 15 feet, and 2 hems, each of 24 feet. That's more than 240 feet of backstitch. Curtain rings would need to be attached to the inside seams at roughly 1 foot intervals, not on every seam, but on the way. A total of 5 rows of curtain rings, so that's at least 60 curtain rings, each hand sewn. Good sturdy cord would be threaded through the curtain rings and across the top of the curtain and down to pullable height. About 90 yards of sturdy cord. Now, green baize is a coarse woolen cloth. It was used to cover billiard tables and service doors. It was also used for sturdy aprons for such workers as butlers and footmen when cleaning the silver or trimming lamps. It's a heavy, serviceable cloth. Just imagine the weight and the difficulty in manoeuvring such an enormous construction. Constructing that expensive, quite unnecessary curtain would have been laborious, boring, heavy, time-consuming work. Now, the sewers would not have used the type of backstitch that we use today. I always hate backstitch because it's a really tedious sort of stitch. They used to use a thing called running backstitch for most of their sewing. We're going in, out, back, in, out, back. They would use full back stitches. It had to reinforce the underarms. If you're sewing a dress, for instance, you needed a bit more strain, so you put double back stitch. So I would say in the curtain, and probably just at the end of each seam. So it was a bit quicker, but nevertheless, the making of this stage curtain would have required the services of all the housemaids for most of every day and well into the night for many days. And remember, the housemaids lived in, and they were not on an 8-hour workday. They couldn't go to bed till their work for the night was finished. Also remember that the normal work of lighting fires, cleaning grates, making beds, emptying bedpans, sweeping floors, polishing furniture had to be done. And there is no mention that extra domestic staff were employed to help carry out the smooth running of the establishment. Not only did the housemaids and Fanny Price, supervised by Mrs. Norris, of course, make the stage curtain, they also had to make the costumes. We know that these would have been elaborate because Mr. Rushworth excitedly tells Edmund, "I am to be the Count Castle and to come in first with a blue dress and a pink satin cloak, and afterwards they are to have another fine fancy suit by way of a shooting dress." Now, since the action of the play takes place in one day and the activities the characters undertake require no special clothing, there's really no need for any of the actors to change their clothes. But we know that Count Castle, a small role, only 42 speeches, remember, is going to have a costume change. We learn as the novel progresses that Fanny's making his pink satin cloak, which Mrs. Norris had organised so that only 3 seams to be sewn, presumably a centre back and 2 side seams, plus, of course, the facings, the hemmings, the finish of the garment. That's a fair bit of sewing, even with only 3 seams. Perhaps the elaborate shooting dress can be put together with Mr. Rushworth's own wardrobe, because that would involve tailoring beyond the time and capabilities of the housemaids. Even if Mr. Rushworth was the only one to have a change of costume, and if there was some supplementation from the actors' personal wardrobes, the collection and organisation of costumes would have been a time-consuming exercise. The young people do not appoint a wardrobe mistress, but Mrs. Norris seems to take on this responsibility, and although she thinks she's a good organiser, she's really just a fuss-spot, creating more problems than she solves. The task of wardrobe mistress requires attention to detail and efficiency. Fanny is the one who really does the work of the wardrobe mistress without giving any credit. Tom Bertram would be the easiest to supply with costumes. He was easygoing and enthusiastic. Tom Bertram's idea of playing multiple roles would be to exchange one funny hat for another. The hardest thing would be to restrain him. He would wear his own trousers and boots and shirt, put on an apron when playing the landlord, a smock when playing cottager, and a sober coat when playing the butler. The apron and smock would probably be made by the sewers, because even if Tom did not object to borrowing a smock from a farm labourer, other members of the cast might well object to being too close to a garment that probably did not smell very sweet, even poswashed. Both Mrs. Grant and Mary Crawford would look through their own wardrobe and make whatever slight alterations that might be needed themselves with the help of the parsonage servants. Maria may well have decided that her own clothes were too young and too pretty for a woman who was fainting from lack of nourishment, and she would demand a dress more suitable to the role of Agatha. This would be sewn by her personal maid, who, as a result, would be spending less time in constructing the stage curtain. Yates was a guest in the house, so the resources of his wardrobe would be limited. As he was playing Baron of Wildenheim, he would need to look grand. He could probably do this by wearing his own clothes, covered by a rather elaborate cloak to swish as he made his ranting speeches. But that would have to be sewn and decorated by the ladies. Henry Crawford had to appear as a soldier's uniform. Since he was a German, he did not have to look as authentic as if he was playing a role of an English military man, but there would need to be braids sewn on a coat, a cloak of some kind, and headwear that passed through a military cap. In summary, the housemaids and Fanny would, as well as making the stage curtain, would have to sew a pink satin cloak, a blue jacket, a man's apron, a peasant's smock, a dress for Maria, an elaborate cloak for John Nates, a military cloak for Henry Crawford, add braids and buttons to the old coat for Henry's. Look, even in using the latest Bernina, there is quite a lot of sewing. When using a needle and cotton in the light of working candles, the work would seem never-ending. There was indeed a great deal of needlework to be done. And all of this effort was expended for one night of display. I wouldn't say it's enjoyment, because you may be sure that the audience who were to watch, Lady Bertram in sleep, would be polite rather than enthusiastic. And the actors would be sure that one of the others had done or neglected to do something and destroyed their best line or their important entrance. Well, as things turn out, the play was never performed. On the night when they were to have the first regular rehearsal of the first 3 acts, all in one place at one time, Sir Thomas returned from the Antigua, and he was so horrified by what they were doing that the play never went ahead. But all was not lost. Mrs. Norris contrived to remove one article from his sight that might have distressed him: the curtain. over which she had presided with such talent and such success, went off with her to her cottage, where she happened to be particularly in want of green baize. Let's look at the cost involved in the staging of the play. Edmund questions their right to spend money on the play and is told by Tom perhaps it might cost £20. Tom's notion of costing the play is a guess rather than a considered opinion. The guess is made well before the play is even chosen. His wild guess is much less than the real cost of staging the play, but even so, £20 was a considerable sum to expend on such a luxury. John Wiltshire, in his notes to the Cambridge edition of Mansfield Park, cites as an example of the spending power of £20 that in 1800 the butler at Englefield House in Berkshire received a salary of £20 per annum. The cost of staging the play would have been considerably more than the annual salary of a butler, the highest paid member of the household staff. Employing a scene painter from London would cost at least £7. His travelling expenses from London to Northampton, a distance of 70 miles, and that's assuming that he travelled by stagecoach, which is more expensive if you travel with mail coach, would have been approximately £1 10 each way. That is a total of £3 just to get there. He would have brought with him or had conveyed by carrier his tools, paints, 5 large canvases and 10 smaller wing canvases. Transporting these tools of his trade would at least another 10 shillings to his costs. And then there was his wages and the cost of hiring or buying the canvases and wings and paint. So, as well as having spoilt only the floor of one room, ruined all the coachman's sponges, and made 5 of the under-servants idle and dissatisfied, the total cost of employing the scene painter would have been at least £7, plus the hidden costs associated with his board and keep that would be absorbed into general housekeeping, and the loss of useful labour of the 5 under-servants who had been sent to help him. Considering the above information, you will see that my estimate of £7 to employ the London scene painter is conservative. The cost of building a stage would not be inconsiderable. Sir Thomas's Bertram was the room behind, which that was what they used as the green room, and there were 2 doors that go onto the stage. That means the stage has been built up, so therefore you've got to have a couple of steps to get up. So it's all got to be built. Then you've got the stage, you've got a green baize curtain, but you have what's called an apron, and stages at that time had a few feet in there. Soliloquies and things like that were usually played on those. We've been generous with how many are coming to see the play. I think that could just as easily just have 3 spindly chairs there and Pug's basket, but that's it. But they've all got to be built. And you've got to raise up. So the stage floor would be raised above the floor by as much as 3 feet and really send the width of the room. You're looking at about 180 square feet of flooring, plus the appropriate amount of timber to underpin and support the floor. The 2 sets of steps to allow the actors in. No doubt there was some lumber available on the estate in Christopher Jackson's workshop, but that would have been acquired for the maintenance of estate buildings and fences, so would have to be replaced. There needs to be some special purposes timber brought in. Nails and screws and labour will also be diverted from normal estate needs, and so estate expenses will be subsidising the theatre build. It's unlikely that the cost of building the stage will be less than £5 or £6 plus the subsidisation of normal estate expenditures. And I also think the proscenium arch was probably going to be very elaborate and very expensive. And I haven't taken in all of that in the costing. Now, let's look at the cost of the stage curtain. Now, even though Mrs. Norris managed to save 3/4 of a yard of green baize in the cutting out of the curtain, at least 60 yards of fabric will be needed. And now the cost of fabric. In 1794, Mrs. Austen paid 4 guineas, 42 yards of blue and white checked cotton to furnish bedroom between Jane and Cassandra. And the hangings would have cost, that works out about 2 shillings a yard. And 2 years earlier, in fitting up his home in Dean, Jane Austen paid £13 of 17 shillings and 11 pence, £13, 7 and 11 pence, for 115 yards of dimity. That's about 2 and 4 pence a yard. In 1799, while visiting Bath, Jane Austen saw some gauzes at only 4 shillings a yard that were not so good or pretty as her own. So with these costs of fabric in mind, and considering the wild fluctuations in the economy brought about Napoleonic Wars, the cost in 1814 of a serviceable, unglamorous fabric, such as green baize, would have been about 3 shillings a yard. So the minimum cost of that fabric for the stage curtain would have been £9. And then we must add 5 dozen curtain rings, 90 yards of serviceable cord, a considerate amount of sewing thread, some kind of coverages around the ends of the cords on the curtain so that the curtain be pulled, transporting all of these things from Northampton to Mansfield Park. The cost of the stage curtain would have been in the vicinity of £12. Mr. Rushworth's pink satin cloak would have cost at least £1, working on 5 yards of pink satin at 4 shillings a yard. His blue dress, let us assume it was a jacket rather than a full suit, would have added close to another £1 to expenses. A man's apron, a peasant's smock, a dress for Maria, an elaborate cloak for John Yates, a military cloak for Henry Crawford, braid, buttons, trim, would have added at least another £4 to the costume bill, bringing it to a minimum of £6. So the total bill of the production of Lovers' Vows will be, at a conservative estimate, somewhere in the vicinity of £31 or £32. This does not take into account the cost of any labour other than that of the scene painter. 5 men normally employed to carry out such necessary functions as chopping firewood, cleaning the stables, drawing the water and so on, had their labour diverted to helping the scene painter. Christopher Jackson, the estate carpenter, and his workforce were diverted from their normal work in keeping the Mansfield Park estate in good order and condition. Just think if you were one of the peasant people who had leaking roofs, they were put off while you were building this whole stage. The female domestic staff were working what today we would consider unpaid double shifts as they carried out their normal domestic duties and sewed the stage curtain and costumes. Austen shows much about the character of Tom Bertram, the young man who is to inherit the estate, when he has his guesstimate the cost of the production at £20. He is either unaware or unheedful of the basic knowledge of running an estate such as Mansfield Park. He is careless of the welfare of his workforce. He has no idea of the value of money, no understanding or respect for his employees, and no thought of his duty to maintain and improve the estate that he is to inherit. The references to needlework and to the production of Lovers' Vows provide many clues to the characters in this novel, both male and female. Jane Austen was aware of human foibles and she was also aware of not only what had to be done to maintain a household, but how it was to be done. Austen gives a very accurate picture of the role that needlework, both useful and ornamental, played in the life of a woman. She can tell us much about the character and the life experience of 19th century women through her references to needlework. So I hope this brief outline of the play of a novel written more than 200 years ago has given you a glimpse into the ordinary, everyday things that happened in a large household, and has shown you how skillfully Austen used these everyday tasks as a literary device to give information about character and status. There really was a great deal of needlework to be done. Thank you.
Do we have any questions from the floor?
It's not a question, but I went back to 1800, and £32 in 1800 would be £3,359 today.
Yeah, it's incredible, wasn't it? Yeah, thank you, yeah. Which he tossed out,
$7,000 Australian to do that.
Without labour.
Yeah, plus the labour cost, yeah. Another question?
Oh, sorry.
Just on that though too, all the embroidery that was done, I mean, that was all by hand, that wasn't...
The thing was that the men take any notice of the hard labour. They took it for granted because they assumed that is part of normal work. And as the young people never even thought how many hours were worked to make that stage curtain.
Thank you, Pamela. I really like the way that you've taken something which is seemingly peripheral and insignificant to the novel and turned it into such a good example of people's characters and how it helped the plot. I'm pretty certain if Tom Bertram was moved forward to the future, he would buy his mother an iron for Mother's Day. Yes, every Mother's Day. And I really appreciated too the way that you've used your obvious personal experience in the theatre to give us an insight into what was going on there. And I don't like Fanny, but now you've given me another reason to feel sorry for her. Sitting for hours on the sofa with Lady Bertram is just, that would just be torture for me, and more feeling sorry for Fanny. Thank you very much, Pamela. We really, really appreciate you doing it.
Yeah. My next job in Hunter, JASA, is justifying Mrs. Elton.
Oh, that'll be nice.